So Kirby, thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak. I feel like this couldn't be more timely that Senate Bill 181 has passed, and there's a lot of wording in there around adverse health impacts, and we've been talking for the last couple of days about what that means. And Jeff Robbins just spoke about really how creating the objective criteria. So as a scientist, I love hearing those words, objective criteria, and because I like data, and I think data can inform policy decision making. So especially around the fact that he talked about evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts. So as a toxicologist, I think of evaluating cumulative impacts where risk assessment, health risk assessment, I should say, because we've heard the word risk assessment kind of thrown around today. There's different ways you assess risk. You assess risk to a lot of different things. One of those things can be a health risk assessment. So as toxicologists, that's part of what we do is evaluating quantitatively and objectively how you assess health risks, specifically to situations like this would be in oil and gas with community exposures. So that's what I want to talk about today, primarily around measuring exposures and health risks to oil and gas related chemicals. And I say boom or bust because, let me go on here. So first I'm going to just kind of put this quote because I think we need to replace fear with data. We've been attempting to do that over time. But this quote I really like because the oldest and strongest emotion in mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. And that is what we're dealing with. As scientists, we're dealing with the perception of risk, not just necessarily what the actual risks are. So today, what I'd like to do is do a little bit of educating around how we evaluate health risks. So the unknown and the fear of the unknown does not need to occur when it comes to health risk. Health risk information can be, health risks can be measured. There are quantitative guidelines established by health regulatory agencies, such as the US EPA and the CDC, that we use as scientists to measure and quantify health risk information depending on your situation and the question that you have. One of the main things, and I think this has been reiterated in some of these conversations, is before you go out and start collecting data or any kind of information, you've got to start with why. Why are you doing this? Why are you going out and collecting information? That's not at the whim of what one citizen or somebody else says. You've got to really thoughtfully think about why you're collecting that. And assessing risk needs to really be fit for that purpose. And then I can't emphasize this enough because we hear things in the media all the time and people get fearful around this fact that because a chemical can be detected in the air or in the water, that it must be toxic and we're all at risk. So as a scientist, I'm going to tell you a little bit more around just because a chemical is detected, it doesn't mean that it's toxic in the amount that it's detected, and we can quantify that and understand that. And then lastly, I'm just going to go through, not all data are created equal, okay? So not all data can inform you around health risks. You can generate data, but you better know what you're going to do with it. So that's why I said addressing health risk concerns can either be a boom or a bust. So what I want to provide you with is a little bit of information at a high level of how you can do that with kind of making it a boom. Again, I said you need to start with why. What are your objectives when you start to evaluate the adverse health impacts? So Prop 181 talks, one component of that is about being able to regulate, especially at local government level, to minimize adverse impacts to public safety, health, and welfare. So the question is, what will you determine as adverse? What does adverse mean? How will you determine this? And then what kind of actions do you plan to take with that kind of information? Setbacks, BMPs, air monitoring, what are you going to do with that? So those are all things that are very important, is to assess your purpose of what you're going to do and define these things before you go out and start to collect data or information. So where does health risk and the kind of work that I do as a toxicologist fit into your public health decision making as local governments or regulators at the state level? So health risk assessment is not an end in itself, okay? It's just a means to develop policies that make the best uses of resources to protect the health of the public and ecosystems. That's defined by the National Academy of Sciences in one of their reports. So it's one component to the kind of information that all of you need to take as regulators at the local and state level. You have legislative mandates, 181 for example, you have social concerns, you have economic concerns. So health risk is just a piece of that puzzle to provide you with objective quantitative data to assess decision making. So what is risk and health risk specifically, okay? So when we assess health risk, it takes two parts, hazard and exposure. Hazard, let's see if I got this. There we go. Hazard is the inherent ability of a chemical to cause harm, okay? Exposure, on the other hand, is contact between a chemical and a person. In order to have risk, you don't just have a chemical that has the ability to have harm, you have to have some kind of exposure and at some level. So risk assessment is the process by which we quantitatively evaluate the possibility of a harm arising from exposure to a chemical or multiple chemicals, the case of oil and gas exposures, under very specific conditions, which is why I go back to saying you need to know your why. What conditions are you wanting to evaluate this under? So what do we do and how do we as scientists measure hazard? So I couldn't have asked for anything better to talk about hazard versus risk than what came out in the Denver Post only a couple of weeks ago in the front page article around air pollution and air toxics coming from oil and gas. And this was one of the tables that was put in there. And it said at every stage of oil and gas extraction, toxic chemicals are released into the air. So it lists for every phase all of these chemicals that could potentially be released, and then these long lists of all these health effects. This is what us toxicologists consider a nightmare in a media relationship standpoint, because what is missing is exposure information. This is what I mean by hazard. So at some level, it is possible that these types of chemicals could cause those health effects. But at what level? What level are we measuring, right? Could it or could it not cause that? So you can't just make blanket statements like this. It's completely inaccurate. So how do we assess what level is safe as a scientist? Just because a chemical is detected that it's toxic doesn't mean it's in the amount detected. As scientists, we evaluate this relationship between the exposure and an effect. As toxicologists, we're very interested in this dose-response curve, the slope of this curve, which is really the potency of a chemical, the ability of a chemical to cause some kind of health effect that we're interested in. And this is different for every kind of chemical, right? I mean, everything is toxic at some amount. It's just a matter of how much. And that's what drives us to be able to understand risk, is how much, and then we compare that to how much people might be exposed to in an environment. So at some level for chemicals where we have this observational range where there's some kind of response and effect, there are generally some levels where we don't observe health effects, okay? So that is the kind of information that we as scientists use to establish exposure guidelines that we can use to assess risk to people. So, for example, in this range of observed effects, there's some level of kind of this slope of information. Generally, exposure guidelines are developed that are in this range of non-observed effects. So it's generally highly protective so that we as scientists can make decisions around risk, what we prioritize as risk, and what kind of further studies might need to be done. But again, these These exposure guideline levels are generally 100 to 1,000 times lower than where we see adverse toxicity occurring. And the reason I emphasize this is because what I'm seeing more and more is that as the public want more and more transparency of data, these numbers are being used out of context. And it's really concerning to me as a scientist because these are guideline levels to inform us as scientists on how to assess risk, risk mitigation, further studies. They're not black and white, right? So that's just something that I'm seeing more frequently occurring. What exposure guidelines should you use? So exposure guidelines are developed by a variety of agencies for very specific scenarios under specific conditions. And that's why as toxicologists, we use them depending on the question. Again, I go back to what is your why? And that's, you can't just grab numbers and evaluate that. So, so measuring exposure, this is where I want to talk a little bit more around the details of this. When I talk about exposure, I'm talking not just about what measurement of a chemical you find in the air. Exposure requires not only how much, but how long. Is this an exposure that's just a short-term exposure? So oil and gas operations and emissions, you don't have continuous exposures happening. You know, you might get emissions that are highly variable. So how do you deal with that kind of information to assess risk? And then how often? How frequent? You know, once, intermittently, every so often? Or are we talking about constant exposures over a lifetime? Those are all the kinds of things you have to think about from an exposure standpoint when you're designing and developing studies to measure what's in the air. So what do you do from a sense of measuring exposures? There's lots of ways to measure an exposure or to evaluate exposure for a risk assessment. You can start, you know, you've got to have some source. In the case of oil and gas, there's some emissions. Then these emissions become external, kind of an external exposure to somebody, maybe community air monitoring, that kind of stuff. Well, you've got to inhale that amount. A person inhales some level of a chemical in the air, and you get an internal amount or an amount in the body of a chemical. So this is kind of this exposure continuum or a pathway. And these are all different levels of exposure. Okay, 5 minutes. All right. So source data, emissions. So we hear, you know, I think Senate 181, in the bill 181 says something around may be able to do emissions of methane and VOC monitoring and stuff. So I don't know what the intent of that specifically is in the bill, but from a health risk perspective, emission information or fence line air monitoring might be able to tell you something about community health risks if you use models like dispersion models that can predict ranges of exposure scenarios. But directly in and of itself, fence line air monitoring or emission information is not going to provide you a direct measure of community exposures. It's not what a person is breathing at a fence line. But you can use models to be able to do predictions of that. Community air monitoring. So generally, this is the most direct way of measuring exposure to somebody of chemicals in the air. It provides you a good estimate that's directly in exposure in communities without the use of models. You can determine generally the source of the exposure, depending on how you design the study. And the measurements and analytical methods are well established. And again, this type of information you can directly compare to guideline values that are established. However, what I'm going to say is there's a lot of caveats with that. The data are only as good as the study design. You can, what we like to say at CTEH is you can produce data or you can produce data. So, you know, you can produce some information, but it might not give you much. So don't, you know, just don't go out collecting information. And then lastly, what Kirby did want me to highlight, because this has also been a topic that I've dealt with quite a bit when I was at the State Public Health Department, biomonitoring. This has been a big thing with the public of wanting to go out and get their blood tested for chemicals. So the pro of that is, yes, it gives you a direct evidence, yes, you were exposed to a chemical. But it can be useful maybe if you add it with other pieces of information, like air monitoring. You're going to have to use kinetic models, epi studies. Maybe you're looking at clusters of health effects in a population. However, with this information directly, you cannot provide information on the source of where that came from, what the exposure was to that person, or multiple exposures, oil and gas, non-oil and gas, and it won't give you information on a health risk. And the feasibility, cost, time, number of people, that kind of stuff, it's invasive. The methods are complicated, and we have no established health guideline values for these informations from which to compare, and risk communication can become a big issue. So interpreting data to characterize exposure from biomonitoring. So if you've got an internal estimate of dose, for example, of benzene, it's telling you, yeah, there's benzene in the blood. I have no idea what the external exposure is, and where did it come from? What's the source? What activities happened? Weather, timing, stuff like this is very difficult to identify and control an exposure. How do you control an exposure if you don't know where it's coming from? So from a regulatory standpoint, this kind of information doesn't provide you with information to make decisions around how you can manage those types of exposures. And then you can't interpret it for data directly for health risk assessment. Remember, like I said, as toxicologists, we use information on a measured environmental exposure, comparing that to an exposure guideline value. Most of those guideline values are derived compared to external exposure measurements, not internal. This is just an example of, say, for example, 5 individual people that have taken one single sample of benzene in their blood. These are people from different areas, different communities, different ages, different sexes, and then I found benzene in my blood. What do I do? Why is it there? What's my health risk? And where did it come from? How do you answer those questions like that? There are ways we as scientists can interpret it. Where did it come from? Well, benzene can come from a lot of things, not just oil and gas. In fact, benzene can be detected in the general population. The CDC's normal reference range in their what they call NHANES study, it's a biomonitoring study of people across the US, benzene normal range, look at, is this. You're going to find it. If you will detect it probably, in probably all of our blood, for example. So what do you do with that information? What is my health risk? Again, you need to know what's the environmental exposure. If you have an external exposure, but these are blood samples, so somehow you've got to be able to do a translation of that. This is where we as scientists can use, if they're available, pharmacokinetic models that can translate this to an external exposure and can give you some estimate of that. But again, you've got to compare apples to apples, right? So you need data. You still need air measurement data. You need to get out and get some air measurement data. And then you can start, as scientists, we can kind of use those models to kind of do some comparisons of, if we collect air data, we could say, what could that be in the blood? You could compare it to people's blood measurements and say, is this lining up, that all their exposure could have been from the air? But it's pretty challenging. So where do you go? Biomonitoring in and of itself has uncertainty at all levels. I list them out here, and I'm just going to say this can quickly become a major risk communication and public health decision-making nightmare. It's possible, but again, you need to think about what question you're asking. This is another report by the National Academy of Sciences that I thought is just what they've stated around the biomonitoring. It has a far greater potential to generate concern and action than just measuring contaminants in the environment. And because of social and political climate issues around biomonitoring, that it's contentious, politically factious, policy debates and litigation around this render it likely that studies will be conducted or interpreted to meet agendas of specific parties. And that's my concern around some of that kind of information. So if you're really wanting to ask the question around what are the exposures and health risks and the adverse impacts from a health perspective, you really need to start here in evaluating real exposures, especially if you're trying to understand that relationship to oil and gas. So you can go from health risk being a black box and uncertain, and adverse impacts being this uncertain fear, to being able to really make informed decisions if it's done objectively using valid scientific methods that we use as scientists. And that's it.